Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Relating to DevSecOps, where we explore the development, security, and operational issues of today so that we can solve real-world problems with people that face them. I know it's been quite some time since we've been in front of you all or in your ears, but we have had a lot of exciting things. There's been conferences and hacker summer camps and Black Hat, DEF CON, trainings and travel. But Mike and I are back in the saddle after a little bit of a hiatus, bringing you top quality content. Mike, welcome back from all of your extracurricular activities. How are you doing today?
That makes it sound way more weird than any of my life is, but I'm good. Yeah, glad to be back in the saddle. It has been quite some time, as you said.
Well, there's no criminal activities, hopefully, because
You have to be caught to be a criminal,
That's true. They have to know.
Yeah.
So today we'll jump right into it. I think we've had plenty of time to think about topics and what we wanted to talk about. And I feel like it is compliance season. It is I've had a number of conversations with other practitioners around working through their compliance goals and working with auditors. And one of the common themes you and I had talked about earlier this week was around vulnerability management, SLAs, and sort of the overwhelming and sometimes debilitating task application security or even just product and software security teams have with meeting their compliance goals, and wondering if a lot of these organizations that are certified SOC 2, ISO, PCI are doing it well and just how they tackle them at scale. And I thought we could sort of pull back the curtain a little bit on, I guess, what you and I face in those worlds. And you and I have both been through these scenarios multiple times with multiple different certification types and compliance badges of honor or badges of checkboxes. I don't know. And we are definitely of the ilk that believe in security, as a path to achieving compliance, but not necessarily compliance for compliance's sake. We don't like checkbox security. That is something we're both pretty allergic to. So I thought it'd be good to just chat through that and chat through approaches and hopefully leave folks with, like, how do I tackle this if I'm new to an organization or if I'm handling legacy stuff? So we'll start there with just maybe defining, what is the problem of vulnerability management and where are we at today? And it would be good to hear your take on this, Mike.
So we're doing like a 3-hour long podcast today. That's what you're saying? To cover,
no. Cut a zero off of that.
Takes on this.
Cut a zero off of that, friend.
Yeah, I mean, God, it's such a wide topic, and we talked about it in terms of compliance. I mean, from my perspective, and when we work with clients, we see a ton of pressure from these compliance frameworks and from auditors who are enforcing them for clients to make sure that their vulnerabilities are remediated. We see that pressure from like SOC 2 auditors mostly for our clients, but obviously for the larger ones, they're under different types of audits, especially in the financial space. So they have a big focus on vulnerability assessment and fixing vulnerabilities. And yeah, there's a huge amount of pressure, and it is a little security theater, and it's a lot of security theater, and it's a lot of work. And to your point about saying compliance is not always the end goal, like we want to get there with good security, but it's not always a thing that you focus on the most. But because of vulnerability management and how there's so many vulnerabilities, a lot of it's due to the rise in all the CVEs and like libraries and packages and everything like that. People are fighting those all the time, and it just eats up so much more of people's time fixing those things to be quote unquote compliant, even if it's not really addressing a security issue. We have a client who's very smart about their vulnerability management because they're actually a security client, and they a very high bar for anyone actually reporting a CVE to them, which is it has to be proven to be exploitable, which as a consultant is kind of a pain to do, but as like from their perspective, I see why they do it, because otherwise every single person who says, "Hey, you have a CVE, you know, go patch this," and they're like, it's not exploitable. It's not even in use in our environment. You know, that would eat up all their time from actually doing real security. But a lot of folks can't draw that line in the sand, and so they get so bogged down in trying to fix vulnerabilities because of compliance frameworks saying no highs, no criticals, whatever. Um, and so yeah, it's a big issue that we're facing these days, and hopefully auditors are waking up to there's a little bit of gray area in these things, and they're learning about like exploitability versus just someone creating an SBOM and that SBOM having a vulnerability tied to some package version. But I don't know if we're quite there yet. I think we're still trying to find the tools to solve that issue. I mean, you work with a lot of internal security teams as well, so I'm curious your thoughts on like, have you seen that struggle, and is there any progress being made?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think you and you and I have talked about this previously, but it kind of brings up the question: when does a vulnerability hit your SLA, or when does a vulnerability become a vulnerability? There's and I don't know what the perspective is of other practitioners on this, but I think that there's some nuance there. You know, there's a few ways to think about whether a vulnerability matters. You just mentioned one, which is if it's exploitable. So is your SLA only for exploitable vulnerabilities and you ignore the rest? I think the which I don't suggest, but I think that the interesting thing that I've seen in organizations is there is an SLA around criticals and highs and mediums and lows, but very often, and I don't think that there are many security practitioners that would disagree with me here. The reality is that many mediums and lows are ignored for months, years, never meet their SLA. These companies are still achieving compliance. How do they do that, and what's the strategy, which I want to get into? Um, but I would say that the first nuance for me is like, when do we define a vulnerability getting into the queue? For this organization, it sounds like if it's not exploitable, it's not a part of the vulnerability management sort of queue. In which case, I could say that from a compliance standpoint, it would be that as long as that's in their vulnerability management policy, the auditor would probably pass them. So I think, organizations can handle this in the very naive way, which you see, which is, and we talked about this in the VCSO episode, if I don't know about it, it doesn't exist, right? And so there's a strategy which I've seen more often than I'd like to, of we have great SLAs. We meet 100% of our SLAs because we just don't know about all the vulnerabilities. So it's like, we have one tool implemented and we solve all of those 100% of the time, which is going to get you through a compliance audit. This is why I think it's a problem. I mean, to a degree, if you're completely, bare and you have no tooling, then it's there. But the auditor can only really go with what evidence is there. Then there's the other side where you have like the security practitioners that very much care about quality. And then they're like, oh my God, I've got thousands and thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities that I can't handle. In which case, I think it's more about that conversation with the auditor, which was actually your point in our sort of pre-call. So I'll sort of hand it over to you on that, of like, how important is the relationship with the auditor balanced with a good security practitioner's desire to do the right thing or to create, a good security posture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it reminds me of a talk I saw at Forward CloudSec by a guy named, I'm trying to find his name, AJ Yan, as in the yawn you make when you listen to this podcast. Just kidding. But he did a whole talk about SOC 2 just being like so behind the times and so missing the moment, and how people are compliant, but they're not actually secure. And we work with a lot of smaller companies that are SOC 2 compliant. We go through SOC 2 as well. And so we kind of know the dirty little secrets of it. It's kind of like a self attestation process where you say what you mean by secure, what is compliant, then you pay someone to come in and say, do you meet your requirements? But if you define a pen test in your policies as I run Nessus against one IP that doesn't have anything on it, and then completely ignore everything else, you probably will find an auditor who will pass you on that. That doesn't mean you're actually secure. But I mean, I think in the better scenarios where we're working with smart auditors, to kind of what your point is, like having a good relationship with them and being able to talk through the nuance of findings, like that's the difference between a good auditor and a bad auditor is. And I think we've probably worked with plenty of both, where if they don't have the technical knowledge, like if they're just a pure, I roll up with a spreadsheet full of questions and I don't understand anything underneath, like, that's a bad auditor who's just going to create so much more work for you. If you can sit there and talk to an auditor about why something's not exploitable and why, like, yeah, the CVE that's reported on this package is critical and the CVSS is 10, but it doesn't apply to us because of X. Like that's a good auditor you can work through issues with. You, of course, then have to go and like talk to your clients about that. If you're like a B2B and you sell to companies and have to explain, why you're not vulnerable, and that's a whole effort as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it is like having that relationship with your auditor, not manipulating them necessarily, but being able to explain the full picture to them is really important. And I think, I go back to my early days in being in security and be like, compliance sucks, auditing sucks. I was doing a lot of PCI stuff and that was just the worst. And you just have this kind of, my view was just very much like security is the cool and pure thing. Compliance is just the stupid thing you have to do to check a box, and it's not actually making any changes. But if you, again, grow up like I eventually did and work with your auditors, work with your compliance frameworks, like it can be a powerful tool, and you can actually find the middle ground a lot of times, which is what you have to do constantly.
Yeah. So talking about that middle ground, do you have advice for folks? Like, let's talk about like sort of three buckets. Since we know that auditing, let's just like focus on SOC 2 since you brought it up. Let's say that like you have SOC 2, that SOC 2 really is not a self-attestation model, but I understand what you're saying there. Basically, like you define the policies, and if you meet the policies, then you'll be you could probably get marked as secure even if you have ignored tens of thousands of issues.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming that everything is coming from the perspective of a security practitioner that wants to do the right thing and create a secure organization or like a robust organization, and they're handling this vulnerability management policy, is it better to have a vulnerability management policy that is highly descriptive and has clear SLAs for these different sort of stages of vulnerabilities and how to define a vulnerability? Or is it better to have something that's a bit more vague and flexible?
That's a good question, because I mean, I think the thing is like, you do want to give yourself some flexibility because you're not always going to be perfect. And do you want to fail your audit for some like small technicality, or again, like some vulnerability that isn't exploitable or isn't as impactful due to some control you have behind the scenes? I think there does need to be some flexibility, even for us. Like, we're a relatively small company and have 15 or 20 different systems. If we write a password policy that's too restrictive, like we want to say 50 minimum across the board, but if we write that and we have a single tool that doesn't enforce that, we have a failed finding according to our auditor. So you have to have some flexibility, but I really think it is like, it's not the letter of the law, it's the spirit. If you use SOC 2 in the spirit it's meant to be, or any compliance framework that it's meant to be used in, you'll become more secure. If you just want it because your clients say, hey, I need you to be SOC 2 because I have to be SOC 2 and everyone below me has to be SOC 2, yeah, you're not going to make a big difference. But I think my view on it is it's an opportunity to make those changes, and you do have to leave yourself some flexibility, or yeah, you paint yourself into a corner And then you're like, I tried to do the right thing and I screwed myself over. And now I have a failure on my SOC 2 report that I have to explain to every single person who
Right.
asks for it.
Yep. So it sounds like, and tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth here, that you're saying like a more of a dynamic policy that leaves room for you to be able to handle issues and exceptions.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've come across those instances too, where like a policy being too strict, especially since policies don't change nearly as much as technology does. And
Right.
so, you know, it's, eh, yeah, it's always going to kind of get you stuck into a position where, and we've seen it before, I think, where you change something to be less secure to be compliant because you have to be compliant. You don't have to be secure, which is a crazy thing to say.
Yeah, I mean, I look at exceptions as and this because you're dealing. I mean, you have these, you have tech debt. I mean, if you're you know, if you even if you start, this is why so many startups get SOC 2s early, and like you're like, wow, that's great. You know, we're SOC 2 compliant, right? I think it's a lot easier to start from scratch. It's really hard to go into a legacy organization that hasn't been SOC 2 certified, has been in business for 20 years, and then they're like, oh, you know, we can't rely on AWS and GCP SOC 2 anymore. Still happening, by the way. And then you know, you turn on some modern security tooling and it becomes, you know, wild, right? And then you're like, well, how am I even gonna get this? Like, it's impossible. And so I think exception management is a tool that you can use to handle these things so that you can convey that you are working through the security posture in a programmatic and sort of logical way, which is the goal anyway, and still get that certification, right? And still showcase that you're working through that and you can improve over time. I think that there's a misconception that you have to take this overwhelming security posture and make it perfect. And if you've worked at any large organization, let's say over 10,000 people, you know, there's a lot of cruft and you sort of wonder, like, how did they ever get certified? And the difference is that they are prescriptive and you know, it is not boilerplate how they define their policies, and that those policies are written in a way that allows them to handle edge cases and um, and work towards the posture that they want.
Yeah.
Um, so relationships with the auditor. Do you have any advice on how to establish, how to find a good auditor and how to establish a good relationship with an auditor? You know, I think just having gone through that process, having um or knowing the different sort of um quality, like the different quality you can get, even something like a pen test or an assessment. How do you find a good auditor? How do you maintain a good relationship? How do you find somebody that is, you know, willing to work with you?
Yeah, I think the best way to do it is a lot like a lot of services is you have to ask around with with people that you trust who've been in similar positions and who they recommend, because you can say like, oh, go work with one of the big companies. You know, like Align is a huge auditing company, and you can say, oh, I had a great experience with them, and then someone else will say like, oh, I had a terrible experience with them because they have so many different auditors in that firm. You can't always just hire a firm. You kind of have to figure out like, who is the person I'm going to work with, because an auditor is usually one, maybe two people doing these reviews. Like, it's a person who's going to make judgments. They might have a team in the back end they bounce things off of, but like, you're mostly working with a single person who can pass and fail you on these things. So I think, you know, I've asked this question to people before who work in this space, and they're like, do you want a good auditor or do you want an auditor who will pass? And, you know, I think we work with some startups as well. And the first few years of business, they're like, I want an auditor who's going to pass me because I need to be SOC 2. Security is in the top 20 of things I need to do, but it's not the highest priority. I need to actually build a business and be profitable and things like that. So, I think that's the reputation is you have to go off of is it someone who's going to be reasonable, is going to be fair, going to be thorough, hold you to account, but not be completely ridiculous. I think that's the big thing. And it's really tricky because, just like in the security space, things change so often. And if your auditor's not up to date on how things are done or how technology works, you will get yourself, into a position where they don't understand something, but their word is law. And it's really hard to fight against that in certain places. So, I think reputation is a big part of it.
So ask your friends or send us an email.
Yeah. I mean, the peer network, I think is the way that most services get bought these days.
Yeah.
Honestly, people want to work with people that their colleagues trust.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a it just reminds me of whoever like if you're last in your class of PhDs, you still have the graduating class. You might be the worst doctor, but you're still a doctor. It's like same sort of thing with auditors. It's like you can find an auditor that's going to look the other way, and you'll still get the audit. And I think it really comes down to what kind of practitioner you are. And also on the other side of folks like sort of looking for SOC 2 compliance and looking for any sort of compliance certification, can this organization back it up? Are they transparent with how they talk about security? And are they willing to have a conversation more in depth about it? And like, what does that mean? I think if you have a good security team, they might tell you, look, we need to maintain SOC 2 compliance, which I mean all our vendors need to maintain SOC 2 compliance. And so that is a table stakes for, that is just like getting the resume through the door, so to speak. And then beyond that, you're probably still going to have to answer a security questionnaire and work through, the deeper questions for organizations that have a team that want to know and are concerned about security. And, you shouldn't just blindly trust people with certifications, because of this dynamic and sort of difference between types of auditors and whatnot, which is, I think, the critique of the auditing and compliance industry across the board. And, I think very similarly, we have a similar sort of dynamic in security, right? You can have sort of point and click shops, which will give you a network scan and call it a pen test. You have people that will do complete adversarial simulations and really show you where your openings are. So I think, we're running close on time, and I do want to, there's one thing I really want to address in this when it comes to vulnerability management in compliance, SLAs, and that is this, in a software development organization, and to the audience that is in DevSecOps, do you differentiate, or how do you differentiate between this idea of like patchable security issues, where it's like, our critical SLAs within 24 hours, we will patch the issue, like the patch management side, and sort of these non-patchable issues, which might be like custom code that have these systemic issues that might take, months to unwind or may have breaking changes. How do you look at the difference between those two? How do you explain that to an auditor? And maybe to sort of wrap it in a bow, like how do you address that in your compliance or your SLA or your vulnerability management policy?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough one that does pop up pretty often. I'm curious on your thoughts too. I mean, I think for people like end of life software, COTS products, and then like really old custom software, that is where that stuff pops up the most, I think. And any decent sized organization is going to have one of those, if not all three of those at some point. And so I've seen that happen a lot where, especially with like a COTS product, it has some terrible vulnerability that pops up from a pen test. And they're like, we don't have the license to change this. It's not supported. It's like mission critical, and it's still going to flag on your vulnerability management SLA. So you have to put the whole story together. How are you mitigating this outside of actually fixing the root cause issue? And I think that's really like, stop fighting the fight that is not fixable and start figuring out what is the compensating control going to be to build the story around that. Like, don't be like, listen, auditor, this isn't fixable. I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do. Just pass the tests. Be like, okay, it's not fixable, but we're putting this into a segmented network. We have a WAF in front of it. We have additional monitoring in front of it. We're reducing the data, that this thing interacts with. Like, have that whole story around it, and then, have a, a schedule for when you're getting rid of the thing too. Like, that's a big part of it is when does this risk go away? I think across the board, having a story about your risks is a much better thing to have than trying to get to a place where you have no risks. No one ever will, but if you just have a story for how we're going to address these things and what our compensating controls are while we try to get there, like, I think that's the story that works so much better with auditors, with customers, with just about everyone. So that's kind of how I view it. Is it's not black or white. There's usually kind of a third option of trying to build that story and narrative around how you're addressing the risk.
Yeah. I like the story approach. I know when I walked away with that, I like sort of I like formulas for these sorts of things so that I can like put it into an infographic or something that somebody can look at a picture of. And so what I always struggled with the story was, how do I, like, it sounds good for like an initial problem, right? So it's like, okay, I can create this story. And then when you go, all right, well, I have to create like 10,000 stories, like, how do I tackle that at with the auditor if I have all these issues that I know are addressed? And I think for me, it's like, how does something get into, how is something qualified? So it's something we talked about a little bit earlier in the episode, which is it a validated issue? Is it a detected issue? Is it a just known issue? Or is something that's been embedded in the product for a long period of time? We have a guest. Hello. My cat just walked across for folks that are just listening. And so I don't know. I think it's sort of like, how do I bridge the gap between something that is patchable versus something that I have to develop custom code for, and knowing that it's going to be a much longer timeline? I've never seen somebody like turn around a systemic code change that is critical in like 24 hours, especially like when you have that discovery of SQL injection in a legacy product that has been there for 10 years. That is not going to get turned around in 24 hours. And it's unreasonable to think that it will be. So I think the path that you create to handle that is like the important part, but there needs to be a path. And that can be the baseline of every story you tell, right? So is it an exception management policy? Is it a risk management thing? Is it a different category of issue altogether? Like maybe you have a bunch of these legacy issues and they go through an entirely different system. Is it out of scope for whatever audit you're working on? Like, there are a lot of different strategies there. So I think it's like, set the formula for your story, almost like Mad Libs, so that you like Mad Libs for vulnerability management. So it's like, okay, we know how to handle an issue that is systemic and a legacy product that we need a story for, or need a compensating control or a mitigating factor for. So, and I don't know. That's kind of what I was trying to fish for with you, because I don't really know the answer. Like, do you be very explicit about that in the in the policy that you're developing, or do you, like, I don't know, like, or do you create a vulnerability management policy that just accounts for like one type of vulnerability, and then the rest you sort of handle outside the scope of like your auditing documents? I'm interested, sort of your take there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you can build a vulnerability program that can completely capture all of it. I think it goes from vulnerabilities to risk and then managing risk. So what is your exception process, like you're saying, for vulnerability that can't be patched? what is your acceptable risk on it? What are your controls to reduce the risk? And then what does that path, look like going forward? Like, I think that's, you got to have that out in your policies. Like, there's not a single place that's going to be issue free. And so, yeah, you have to have that way to basically say, like, we accept this risk. You don't, like, the only downside to that, I think, is so many cultures become just like corporate cultures become like, I'm just going to accept the risk. It goes on to a risk register. Every 6 months I have to sign off on it. I'm good with that. And like, yeah, eventually that catches up with you. And it is really a cultural thing where if that becomes the norm, then you might as well throw the whole program out. So you have to be kind of careful with like making that too easy of a path. And I've seen some places where it's not an easy path. Like, it's hard to get that exception in place. And that is a good thing because it means that people aren't just checking that box and, filing it away for someone else to deal with after they move on to the next company. So you have to be really careful about that as well. Don't make it too easy on everyone to just file exceptions, or you've done nothing with your vulnerability management program.
Yeah. So, I mean, I like that approach. I think it's just there. I think the long story short is there's no sort of prescriptive way. It is going to be customized to sort of like what your situation is, but you need to make your policies match what you're actually going to do and leave yourself a path to exceptions, and don't have this mentality that every vulnerability that you detect has to go through the same path. Would you say
Yeah.
that's accurate?
Yeah. I think that's definitely true. Yeah. Have a process, but leave it flexible enough to have some weird offshoots.
Cool. So I think to wrap that up, it is just to say that your SLAs are not, you can have different categories. Talk to your auditors, establish good relationships, find a good auditor, make sure that your documents are account for different scenarios or leave you an out, and make sure that you have a relationship with your auditor, that you're educating them on your path. To wrap up this episode, though, Mike, I do want to give you a chance. I know you have some trainings and workshops and things coming up. Where can people find you and get educated and your insights onto, I don't know, what are you working on these days?
Yeah, mostly spreadsheets and emails. That's where my life is. No, I mean, I think my next big thing is I'll be out at reInvent. So if anyone wants to connect out there in December, I'll be in Vegas drawing out like everyone else. I mean that in terms of the lack of hydration there, not something else. But no, nothing else big happening yet. We got to get some more training on the books, and yeah, we'll get this podcast on a weekly basis.
Yeah, we're working on
maybe
it.
Twice a week. We'll go crazy.
Yeah, we'll get up there. We also have some guests coming on shortly, so hopefully you enjoyed Tanya's episode, but definitely have at least one other guest lined up beyond our own voices, and more to come. So we should be able to get some more interesting content, and we are super stoked to be back. Thank you all for continuing to listen and staying on the follow. Appreciate you all. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.